All right, I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's webinar entitled Integrating BIOVIA OneLab to Modernize Your Scientific Workflow, presented by Astrix. And we can go to the next slide, please. Before we get into today's presentation materials, I want to take a moment and explain a little bit about who Astrix is. We have been very active in the webinar and webcast arena these last few years here, really just kind of giving folks our perspective on what's going on in the LIMS and lab informatics and general laboratory technology and R&D technology space, and also bringing in lots of third-party experts and industry leaders, to get their thoughts on what's going on in the process. And the reason we're doing this is, we live in this space. We've been working for over 25 years, delivering very specialized services, processes, and technology, which has enabled us to really become a leading partner globally in transforming the ways that science-based businesses succeed. A couple of quick facts about us as a company. We were established in 1995. We work with a wide array of different vendors and platforms, a la BIOVIA we're talking about today. And we operate from locations in the US and overseas. We have 1,200 employees. But what's really interesting is that 90% of our team members hold advanced science degrees. So we are very much a scientific-based organization. And our headquarters are in beautiful Red Bank, New Jersey. The type of customers that we help, everything from startups to Fortune 1000. These are typically going to be companies in the life science space, chemical, CPG, government agencies, as well as research institutions. Let me go to the next slide, please. Then a little bit about the type of services that we deliver. We are a professional services company, and obviously, we're working with lots of vendors like the BIOVIAs of the world. But in terms of the scope of services, we like to say that we support the continuum of scientific data operations and data management. And the services that we bring to bear are everything from strategic innovation and roadmaps through enterprise architecture. This is really kind of helping companies understand really where their technology needs to lie and what kind of business transformation they have to go through to get them to where they want to be. And even planning out what their overall technology stack is going to look like to move their business forward. And there's a great deal, obviously, of change going on in the space right now. Data management, governance, making sure we implement strategies and methods and frameworks to help you ensure your digital assets are providing intelligent insights. Business analysis, right through solution selection services. Really just not only mapping the people, process, and technology, but then helping you select the right technologies. Again, we have a broad and deep knowledge of the vendors in the space that we bring to bear to help you pick the right solutions based on things that we may have uncovered earlier on in our services projects. We can help develop and implement and validate your technologies. And then even at the end, one of the cool things about Astrix is we have a whole scientific and technical staffing group that can staff not only people to help manage these technologies, but even scientists to help fill up your benches if you need to. So that's a little bit about us as a company. We're going to pivot now and go into our discussion. I want to introduce our speaker for today. Thrilled to have him. Thrilled to be doing a webinar with him again. We go to the next slide here. Adam Riva is our director of LIS here at Astrix. He's responsible for leading the BIOVIA OneLab practice within our laboratory informatics services group. And he has brought over 12 years of experience deploying life science solutions, most of which are directly related to BIOVIA, including their legacy, as well as some of their next generation products. So with that, Adam, I'll let you pick it up from here, and I will pop back on at the end. I'm going to sit back and enjoy the presentation.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Kevin. All right. So hi, everybody. So just kind of first touching on some of the topics that we're looking to cover today. So really the first thing we're going to look at is how do we incorporate BIOVIA OneLab into your existing IT landscape? As many of you know, you have large workflows and many different applications. And the question would be, where can BIOVIA OneLab fit in? Another thing that we're going to look into is ways to further integrations between the BIOVIA OneLab products. So out of the box, there's a lot of functionality that comes that allows the applications to talk to one another, but there's always ways that we can further improve it and make it align with exactly what you're looking for. We want to visit how is this going to impact the user experience. So as you introduce new applications to your environment, then how is the users going to be impacted, and what do you need to be concerned about there? And then lastly, we're going to end it with things to be considering when you're implementing multiple connected systems, with the addition of these systems, there's sometimes topics that people don't always think about and want to be careful of before making the decisions. So before we truly jump into those, first I want to touch on what exactly is BIOVIA OneLab. So BIOVIA OneLab is a family of products that's offered by Dassault Systems. So this first began when Dassault acquired Acceleris back in 2014 and became the BIOVIA brand, or one of the many brands underneath the Dassault Systems portfolio. And sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the Unified Lab. So some of the products that are included within the OneLab portfolio is, so for your administration, first off, it's Foundation Hub, which is the main kind of platform to maintain your users, your permissions, some of your reference data. Next off is the equipment. So this is the registration of the equipment that you'll be connecting and integrating with. So those are your direct connects, your PC-based, as well as your non-connected. And then lastly is your measurement. So it's your measurement store where all these results are coming in, where are they stored, and how are they used going forward. The next is kind of your method and task execution. So we'll start with compose, is where your recipes or your methods themselves are kind of developed and registered within the system. Capture is where these methods or recipes are going to be executed. Review is after it is executed, the reviewer to be able to go in and kind of take a look at what was executed. Did everything go in line with as expected, or is there anything that needs to be flagged or corrected? And then lastly is the task planner, which is kind of a place, I sometimes refer to it as like the binder for the user to maintain all of their samples, their tasks, their results for a particular execution. Next up is the experiments, so your ELN, so it's your workbook and notebook. Then we're going to touch on inventory. CISPro is kind of the main inventory application within the OneLab portfolio, and we do a lot of integrations with CISPro, whether it's from Workbook or Capture, and we'll kind of get to those more as we go forward. There's also samples, materials, ChemReg, and BioReg. And lastly is your data manipulation or visualization. So Python Pilot is widely used across all of the products here. That's definitely the first tool that's used when integrating and when trying to create reports or whatever it may be. Insight's another tool of the Dassault family that is commonly used with customers to kind of do some more indexing and be able to do searching against the data across many different applications. And lastly, it's kind of more in the manufacturing space, is the Discoverant application. All right, so now jumping into the integration itself. So there's many ways that you can integrate with BIOVIA OneLab. The first off that we're going to cover is kind of your system configurations. Things like within Foundation Hub, when you're setting up users, being able to configure it to talk with your LDAP or your Active Directory to have users groups or permissions synced in and their passwords. The next step is the equipment interfacing. So within that equipment module, being able to configure a piece of equipment that's going to be able to talk with an instrument that's in the lab. A lot of this is done with configuration. Some, depending on the instrument, might take a little bit more than that, but a large portion of it is just configuration within the system. And next, another example is your workbook material resolver. Has the ability to, within your experiment, be able to maybe scan a barcode and pull in some fields or values from another application, referred to where all your material data may exist. Sometimes CISPro, sometimes it could be other applications as well. The next is Python Pilot. Like I said, this is the tool that's really most commonly used, and it's really connected to all of the OneLab products. There's different ways to register and implement a protocol that might be developed with Python Pilot. First is kind of a lifecycle subscriber or action. So a lifecycle subscriber would be within task plan, and not necessarily within task plan, but could be in task plan. And as a certain entity changes a state is when this protocol will be initiated and kicked off. It's more for handling something that's done in the background. The lifecycle action is the capability of adding buttons on the top of your screen like you would see in a task plan that essentially does that, runs that protocol for whatever it is developed and designed to do. A more newer approach is the protocol parameters. So introduced more recently into recipes, you can actually configure a parameter within your recipe to actually call on a protocol. And the flexibility of Python Pilot really enables you to do almost anything from that point on, and you can be able to then record the value back into your capture session. And lastly is your compose or capture reports. So at the bottom of the page within capture, you're actually able to run a report This report that's run is just calling upon a protocol, which you can have developed to be able to, again, cover various different functions that you may be trying to implement. And lastly, there's other options as well. So throughout the OneLab suite, there are RESTful APIs. Directly within the application, you can actually take a look at the Swagger document that gives you all of the endpoint data, so you can kind of understand what's supported, what you're able to call on. It gives you examples and some controls there. There is a backend database that sometimes can be used to just simply query and read data from. Within Workbook, there's actually an SDK that could be accessed using C#. We can also, in some areas, call Python code. And then also within CISPro itself, out of the box, it comes with a material import where you can fill out a Excel spreadsheet in the appropriate format and be able to input or import inventory data into the system using that mechanism. Now I want to kind of dig into, okay, there's these various different ways that you can do these integrations. Well, how do you make a determination of what to use when? And sometimes it's controlled by the application itself. So within Workbook, there's a couple different routes, and it's going to be dependent on what you're trying to accomplish. But within Workbook, you could be calling Python. We reference Python Pilot. We can use, like I mentioned a second ago, that C# is be able to use and call that SDK. And then lastly is that material resolver. Most commonly, the material resolver is used when reading CISPro data, but it's not developed in a way that it only is allowed to be used with CISPro. It can be used with other inventory systems as well. Next, we're going to touch on Capture and Task Planner. These are some of the examples that I was kind of touching on before with your Python Pilot registrations. And again, depending on the particular function that you're trying to accomplish, we'll choose which route you should really register the Python Pilot protocol as. The biggest kind of question is, how do you want it run? Is it something that's in the back end, or do you want the user to actually see a report or a page that pops up? And so that will help you make a decision on the best route to go with that. And then next up is the RESTful API. Like I said, a large number of the OneLab applications has a RESTful API that we're able to use and call. It enables you to read data, enables you to post data back into OneLab, and so it's pretty heavily used. Next, we're going to touch on is CISPro. So that also has the RESTful API. There's a database that we can query, and then also that CISPro import that I referred to a minute ago, where if you wanted to populate your system with a large amount of inventory information, you're able to just populate the spreadsheet and use the out-of-the-box functions. And the last I'm going to touch on here is the equipment. So equipment can be handled depending on the type of equipment that it is. So a direct connect is a balance or a pH meter, something in the lab that you're either connecting to using something like RS-232 or Ethernet or even potentially Wi-Fi. You're able to register that equipment in a way that then from your capture session or wherever you're trying to read the data from, the system will know where to read out to and what to expect back. You can register file parsers for your instruments that are more file-based, that are then going to place these files on a network share where OneLab will automatically crawl that network share, be able to consume it, place it in the measurement store, and to be consumed in other applications moving forward. Equipment's also where adapters exist. A very common setup that we work with customers is the generic out-of-the-box CDS adapter. Now it requires some configuring and some setup, but it is a great tool to connect into things such as Empower. All right, so I wanted to touch on a couple of OneLab integration examples. So these examples are kind of taking a look at how complex some of these solutions can become. Where does OneLab fit within it all? And it's kind of the options that are out there. So the first example I'm going to walk through is kind of your quality testing, so your QC, essentially having samples that need a test that's run against it. We need to ensure the quality of this product, and so therefore these tests are then going to be able to call out whether there's limits or thresholds that were not appropriate for that particular product and be able to be flagged at that point. The next example we're going to walk through is kind of your R&D use case with your experiments, working in Workbook. Workbook generally connects into many various different systems, and how that landscape can kind of look and how customers sometimes explore to expand the use of Workbook. So touching first on this quality testing. So right here, what you're going to see is kind of your basic OneLab only execution. It's the most minimized version of it. Essentially, we have Foundation Hub that's managing our users' permissions and our reference data. Compose is where we're going to be authoring these recipes or methods that will be executed in the future. Capture is where those actual executions exist, so it's where the users will be running those particular tests or methods. And then after the execution, we have review, is where the reviewer will actually go in, be able to automatically see, was there anything that was flagged out of limit, was there anything that was manually entered, maybe some observations or annotations were added during the execution that may want to be read and consumed, and so that's where that would happen. Now, I want to mention on this, so for anything that's kind of that quick dotted line, that's more of a configuration, mostly out of the box, just kind of a setup using the applications themselves. Anything that's a dash with the dots is a configuration, plus it could use some development, or it could take one route or the other. And then anything with the solid line is a full-on development that's not out of the box, but it's not necessarily uncommon for us to be developing for customers, and I've seen customers have in place. So going to the next thing is now you can add in things like your activities and task planner. So this gives a bit more flexibility to those methods and recipes that you authored within Compose. This is where you're going to now be able to reuse some of those recipes in multiple different ways and kind of direct the executions based on some child activities that you may have set up. Now with child activities, you can kind of set up what are your input parameters, what materials you're going to be running during that execution, and that'll actually help drive the execution. It definitely minimizes the number of recipes that would need to be developed. And then task planner, I kind of touched on briefly earlier. Like I said, I refer to it kind of as your binder. It's where the scientists, the analysts are going to go in and be able to see all the work that they're currently executing. It's one location where they can see their materials, their samples, their actual tasks that they're going to be executing, as well as the results that are coming from those tasks. We can kind of expand on it more, and a very, very common use case is the capture to CISPro. So CISPro obviously contains all of your inventory. Capture, sometimes we'll do things where we're doing some preparations, or we just want to reference a material that we may be using in that particular test. So Capture out of the box has the capability of having this connection set up. It requires a little bit of configuration at times, depending on what properties you're actually trying to pull in. But again, that's just kind of out of the system. With the expansion of extended properties within CISPro and some of the capabilities, sometimes users want to do more, be able to, when they scan a particular material in Capture, actually have various functions be performed against that container that exists in CISPro. And so it's something that can always be expanded, but it's a very common integration point that a lot of people spend a lot of time on. The next is the obvious connection of connecting in with equipment, right? So being able to, during my execution, simply pull that result from that particular lab instrument right into my capture session is pretty critical. It's very helpful for the user and for the reviewer to be able to not have to transcribe that information over from the instrument into the application, but simply be able to record that value automatically from directly within Capture. And then the third application I added in here was Pipe on Pilot. So we've talked on a little bit on various different ways that you can call Pipe on Pilot from Capture. Adding Pipe on Pilot with that connection just opens up the flexibility to accomplish much more. So this next one, now we're going to start to expand to which applications outside of the BIOVIA OneLab suite might make sense to interface with. And the first, and the kind of the easy integration, which a lot of customers, or I should say most customers do today, is setting up their Foundation Hub to connect into their Active Directory. So getting that LDAP configuration correct. This is really critical to be able to help maintain users' passwords. It is able to sync with your Active Directory to the point that if someone's last name changed or there's an update to their email, whatever it may be, they can have it. So this change only has to be done in one place, which is in Active Directory, and then that change will be pushed down. So it's kind of one of those easy wins that give you a lot of value. So the next up I'm going to talk about is kind of the furthering of that equipment. So connecting in that CDS generic adapter that I kind of referred to before, setting it up to work with the most common use cases with Empower. That from directly within your capture sessions, be able to push and pull data to and from Empower, take back the results, and be able to consume them from there. And then also sometimes we'll do integrations with the metrology. So within the equipment module within OneLab, it does have a logbook and some metrology attached to it with equipment events. It's common that customers already may have a system such as Maximo or something that they're already using within the lab. So there's been times that we've explored and done integrations between that equipment itself and the Maximo system just to keep everything in sync. And that's going to add a lot of value for during your execution. You're going to be able to know if I'm at a particular balance or pH meter. I know if it requires a calibration or verification, and knowing that it's appropriate to use in that specific time is critical. Next, I'm going to add, and this is kind of a common one, and it comes up more and more, is the integration with a LIMS system. So being able to take where all your samples are registered, pass down which particular tests may need to be executed. The LIMS system also contains the specifications. Sometimes customers will want to push those specifications along into their task planner to be able to, on the execution, see real time whether the results fall into a required limit or threshold. Other times, customers will want that raw result pushed back up into the LIMS, and then the LIMS system itself would be responsible for flagging whether or not that result is appropriate. This is something that is, like I said, it's becoming more and more commonly implemented in. It takes out a big manual step of a user having to initiate the creation of these tests and these samples within the system, and being able to just have that automated approach in the background. Next is kind of your method repository. So your document management system containing your actual PDF methods. Some customers kind of design their recipes in a way that they're recreating what their PDF method is within their recipe and compose. Their ultimate plan is to get rid of their PDF or paper methods. More commonly, customers still maintain those paper or PDF methods, and they do have them contained in some sort of document management system. Now, what they want to do is they want to be able to, during their execution, ensure that they're running the latest version, be able to reference that particular PDF or file, essentially have a link out to it so they can open it up on their screen and use it while they execute. Next I'm adding is kind of further integrations with that Python pilot that we added before. So adding additional reports, maybe some sort of custom extension can absolutely be included, as well as email notifications. So it's common in Task Planner that you get a task assigned to you, and you can see that task is assigned to you within the widgets on the homepage of Foundation Hub, but you don't necessarily see it in your email. Some customers want it to be furthered where emails actually get sent to their corporate email network so they can actually receive it and know that it's existing to log into the application to go complete that particular task, whatever it may be. And so this completes the quality testing example. Like you'd see, there's many different systems that are connecting in, and it can become a pretty complex situation. There are other systems that sometimes implemented, but what I'm showing here today is kind of our most common integrations that we work with customers on. The next I'm going to dig into is kind of your R&D experiment. So again, you're in Workbook, you're trying to run an experiment and collect data, starting off with the same basic OneLab only, just here's my Foundation Hub managing my permissions and my reference data, and here's my Workbook application. So I'm just creating experiments and executing within Workbook alone. Now we're going to add the same thing where we have this Active Directory linkage so that the users don't have to be managed manually and replicate that work. Next, we're going to add is, like I said earlier, CISPro is very intertwined with a lot of the applications. Referencing inventory is such a critical piece, and so within Workbook, there's some integrations, like I was mentioning, the material resolver that come somewhat out of the box with minor configuration that you're able to simply set up where you can scan a container, and automatically on the scanning of the container, some of those fields would then come back into your experiment, into your materials table, and you can kind of see which materials were used throughout that experiment. Customers a lot of times like to take it a step further where they can do things like registering of containers directly from their experiment, or when they add a particular material to their experiment, perform functions like opening of the container, right? So we're going to be calculating a new open expiration date, maybe doing some dispensing or disposing from directly within Workbook. So this becomes something that can be very bi-directional and not require a user to be logging back and forth throughout the various applications. It could be all of this can be performed directly within their experiment. The next step I'm going to add is kind of bioreg and chemreg. So this is for your biological registration, your chemical registration. Now, this enables users to be able to perform and create their registrations from directly within their experiment. Upon that creation, automatically there's a reference out to that particular lot or corporate ID that they can reference and be able to connect that experiment to. You'll also see that there's a lot of integrations that happen between bioreg and chemreg and CISPro. Sometimes referencing a particular material or chemical is important for that flow and integration. Another common thing is, so Task Planner and Capture are not only used for your quality methods, sometimes they are used in other ways. So within your experiment, you can actually, and a lot of customers will actually add a section for Task Plan, so they can actually see Task Plan directly within their Workbook client rather than having to log into a web page. And from there, they'd be able to run particular tasks and pull back results, send these results back into that experiment that they're currently executing against, and be able to see all of that data. A couple of common applications that we'll integrate with that are outside of the BIOVIA OneLab suite generally is a QMS system, so your quality management system, or an SDMS. Next, we're going to touch on is your equipment data, right? So just similar as the quality end, sometimes within my experiment, I'm going to be wanting to capture from a particular instrument. I want to pull some results back. I want to know whether or not it's appropriate to be using that equipment at that current stage. So that same integration that we saw on the quality end is very similar here as well, and is very applicable. And then everyone's favorite, Python Pilot. So having Python Pilot just kind of opens up all of that window of having other functions like various reports, email notifications, maybe some custom extension that they may be looking to add. But the second that you have Python Pilot being able to connect gives you that flexibility to really adjust accordingly. So again, this kind of completes the R&D, the experiments end of an example and a common flows that we see. Not that there aren't other applications that it can integrate with. This just kind of shows you how complex and how big these integrations can become, especially over a longer period of time. So now we're going to talk about the impact of these integrations for the users. So what are the users going to expect? What are they going to be running into? So the first is navigating between the various applications, right? So the more integrations that we're creating, some of them sometimes will require a user to log into the various applications. Are they going to have to be bouncing around through various windows and clicking around in order to be able to do the particular functions or see the data that they're expecting? The next is the ease of use, right? So users sometimes aren't the most welcome to change, and so having new integrations put in and new applications connecting in, sometimes a user may have difficulty kind of getting up to speed and understanding the exact use case. Having an integration that's built in the appropriate way and planned out accordingly will make it so it'll be that much easier for the user. The whole goal for these integrations is to make the workflow and the user's experience improved, with still maintaining that quality that's very important. Next is the accessibility of the entire solution. So as many of us know, different applications throughout the landscape today have different requirements to them. One may particularly need to be running Chrome. One may need a client actually installed on your system. So having this entire solution work in a way that it's accessible for all of your users is going to be critical. Next is the additional training that's required. So the more systems and the more integrations that you put in effect, obviously the users need to be trained accordingly and be able to know and understand how they should be using it and what they should and should not be doing. So that training is going to be critical to maintaining that. All right, so items to consider. So what do you want to be careful of when you're implementing new integrations or new systems into your current workflows? So this is probably the most important one that a lot of customers tend to overlook. Is kind of the goal is always to keep a single record of source, right? So if I'm creating a integration between Workbook and CISPro, the first kind of conversation is, okay, what fields are important to pull over into your experiment? customers tend to jump immediately to, we want to just pull in all the fields, we want to be able to see all the data, and I have to kind of go through and explain of why you want to be cautious of that, and really you only want to pull in what's important to you. Having one system to be the record of truth in where you're maintaining everything is going to make your integration, first off, more simplified. Second off, it's going to reduce errors and problems that you may have in the future. Things like certain fields that may have values that change. So if I'm scanning a particular container and I want to record the location in my experiment, as many of us know, the location of a container will move throughout the lab, and that's pretty normal, and it will be updated within CISPro. Now, every time that we update within CISPro, we also have to make that update within Workbook, and then dealing with any difficulties or downtime that you may have with the interface. Now, all of a sudden, you may have records that are no longer aligned. So this is really critical of pulling over what's the most important pieces of data to pull over, and what data should exist in its source system, and maybe have some sort of link or ability to easily maneuver over to that source application to be able to see the most real-time accurate values. Next is the authentication throughout the workflow. So each application has a different mechanism for authenticating into. With OneLab, especially doing the RESTful APIs, it's really based on tokens, and so there are mechanisms to be able to authenticate in. It's critical and important and required that the user is going to have permissions into that particular area and have access rights into those whatever data you're trying to access. Connecting into external systems may require a user have to log in, and a lot of this is controlled because each application has its own way of authenticating. They have their own user management, and so this is especially applicable as you integrate with things outside of OneLab. Staying within OneLab, there's a lot of flexibility with everything connecting into Foundation Hub that makes authentication that much easier. The next is the impact to licensing costs, right? So if we're adding more applications and we are adding all these integrations into those applications, it's more users accessing them, and it's more licenses that may be required. These additional costs just have to be something that's taken into account and considered when bringing in a new application or a new system. Also, what value does it bring, right? So there's a lot of integrations that you can do. There's a lot of ways to implement it within your environment, but what you really have to visit is how much is it going to cost for me to get there, but how much value is it going to actually give the user? Is it something that's going to save a lot of time for the user, or is it something that's only going to save a couple of minutes a year? So it may not be something that's worth the time to spend on implementing. So you really have to focus on what value is that going to provide you. The next is really what should you focus your efforts on first, and this is I always try to talk with customers. They get very excited about how they can expand out their current system and different workflows that they can increase. But really what you need to focus on is looking forward in the future, knowing the direction you want to go, but what is most important to implement first. Trying to do everything all at once is actually going to make things that much more difficult for you, and that it will eventually just hurt you down the line. Really adding in those efforts that are giving the most value in the entire roadmap and focusing on those one at a time is really gonna help you there. Next is the maintenance of the solution. So implementing all of these interfaces, you probably saw that there's a lot of development and configuration that's involved. What happens with future product releases, or maybe a change to a particular system. Maybe you added a new field to a particular entity that now needs to be passed as well. What is the upkeep and maintenance of that? Not all integrations are foolproof and perfect, so there's also that time when maybe something just didn't transfer correctly, or there was the network was down for a period of time, and you want to be able to have a team that's able to help support that. So that also falls into that maintenance itself. And lastly, are the two systems on the same network? So it's very common that customers will have various different networks amongst their IT landscape, and those networks may not necessarily be able to communicate with each other, right? And so it's very important to determine first, are they on the same network? And if they're not, kind of work through what are some particular ways that you can have them communicate. Ultimately, for it to be feasible, obviously the application would need some sort of mechanism to be able to communicate with the other in order to transfer that data. And that wraps it up from my end. So if there are any questions or things, I think that's it for me.
Yeah, thank you so much. We appreciate that. And again, for the folks, let you know about questions. We wanted to encourage you to certainly ask questions as we go through. If something popped into your head and you want to ask it now, you're welcome to do so. We don't read your name or we don't read your company. We'll just read the question kind of out loud. And then, Adam will do his best, obviously, to answer that. A couple things here real quick. Let me get the